mentioned last week how when you're a pastor, you get to be a part of some very important parts of people's lives. The celebrations, the sorrows, all of those things. And how if you're tuned into it, not just the pastor, but those that you're working with are tuned into it, you can sense the Spirit of God present in all of those situations. The joy of a baptism, that new life, the new life in Christ, the marriage ceremonies. Talked a little bit about that last week, didn't I? The marriage ceremonies where certainly love is paramount and they want God's blessing upon that service. Confirmation, coming up in this church in a few short weeks, where we'll be celebrating young people who have been confirmed in their faith and will be participating in the worship service. How many of you have maybe been to a worship service or just some event in your life and you've been around other Christians and you've just powerfully felt God's Spirit amongst you? How many have had that happen? Yeah. How many have had that happen when you've been off by yourself just quietly and unexpectedly? You feel like you're in the presence of God. Sure. We become so tuned in, I think, to where we expect God to be, that we don't always look for God in places where we don't expect God to be. That makes sense? And we tend to look at some people, the way they live their lives, or perhaps just things around us, and scratch our heads and think, how can they make these choices that are so destructive? What's wrong with that person? Or we look at people that just choose to be negative and do things that certainly don't seem to honor God. We look at those people and at those situations and those lifestyles and we think, what's wrong with them? No wonder God has left them or given them up to their own sinful ways. That's what we think anyway, isn't it? That's how we think. We don't always look for the sacred that exists in all things around us. And quite often where the sacred exists is in those difficulties that we seem to be going through in life. Isn't that right? We don't look for it there. Something bad happens to us, we want to complain or just withdraw, whatever the case might be. And we wonder, where is God? But then we have those holy moments when we know God is very close. We feel as though we can run to a sacred place, or we can enter a sacred place like this, and we expect to sense God's presence. God said, wherever two or more are gathered together, I am there. So we know God is here. And there are certain places that we go to that seem sacred to us that maybe aren't the church. Our homes, the presence of our children, our grandchildren, a Thanksgiving meal when everybody's gathered around the table, and we really sense God's presence, and that is a holy event, a holy moment. But to find God's presence in those places and in those events that make us think God has abandoned those places and those people, that's a whole different thing, isn't it? I say all this as prelude to a story I want to share with you of an event I had at a funeral I was called to do. I spoke about this a couple of years ago briefly. I'm going to give you a little more detail. I want to choose my words carefully because this was not an ordinary funeral service. And some of the events that took place, I want to choose my words carefully because there's young people here amongst us. So you're forewarned. How's that? Wow, everybody's looking like, what's he going to say? Oh, this must be good. It was different. Put it that way. I have always been available to do worship services and especially funeral services for people that don't have a church. I think that's part of the ministry that we're all involved in. And John Wesley said, and we as a denomination believe, that the world is our parish. Not just our local church, not just the membership of this church, but we're all in ministry to people everywhere. And I think we need to take that seriously, and I think we do take that seriously. So, I got a call from a Ann Arbor funeral home. I'm going to say 15 years ago at least. And this funeral home, the director there knew that I will do funeral services for just about anyone. And he used to joke with me, and he would say, well, Jerry, he said, the reason we use you so much is we get a lot of people in here that they don't have a church home, and they don't really have a faith, and they say to me, they say, sir, our loved one didn't really believe in God, and we don't have a church home, and we don't want a service that's going to be overly preachy. And he'll say, I got just a guy for you. You know, I didn't know what to make of that at first. But, you know, I see that as a compliment now. I do. Anyway, he called me and he said, Jerry, we've had a tragedy. Can you deal with this family and take care of the funeral service? And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. And I got the names, like I always do, and the phone numbers to contact people. And I usually, you know, I ask what happened. It was an automobile accident. Okay. Said, I'll go meet with the woman right away. And he said, well, you're going to have to wait a few days. She's still in the hospital. We're holding the funeral service until she's going to be well enough to attend it, because it's her husband that was killed in the automobile accident. I said, well, okay. So I went up to see her actually at the hospital. And she had her leg in a cast, and she was bruised and cut up, of course, from the automobile accident. And she told me what had happened. She and her husband and her son, the little boy, they were traveling to she called it a group meeting that they had out of state, and they'd been driving for quite some time, and they figured he just fell asleep at the wheel, went off the road, hit a telephone pole. He was killed instantly. She was injured. The little boy was fine. And so I sat with her and got all of the information I needed to get, where he worked, where he was born, school he went to, all of these things that you want to remember at a time of the celebration of a life. And I got all of that. And then the funeral home said, we'll call you when it's time for the service. I said, okay. I never got a phone call after a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks. It was almost 2 months. And I finally got the call and said, she's out of the hospital, and the funeral is set for Saturday. Can you still do this? I said, sure. And it was interesting, to say the least. Where do I start? I went to the funeral home. I always get there about an hour early. And I've had my sermon prepared, and all the things that I was going to say prepared to try to celebrate this life with the information I'd gotten. And when I pulled into the parking lot, there had to have been well over 100 of these great big Harley-Davidson motorcycles. They were everywhere. Now, I know there's a God because this was one of those rare events where I wore my clergy collar. I almost never do that, but I was wearing my clergy collar. And I found a place to park the car. A lot of those motorcycles, since I get there about an hour early, a lot of people were still coming in with more motorcycles. It was very loud, because I don't think anybody had mufflers. Very loud as they were parking. And I noticed that I was a little bit overdressed. These were 3 motorcycle gangs from the Detroit area. And they were all wearing their leather jackets and jeans, chains for belts. The women had the leather bustiers. Is that how you pronounce that? I don't know. They were leather anyway. And this looked like a very rough, violent group, which indeed they were. And as I walked in, the funeral director was ready to give birth to kittens. He was one of these type A personalities anyway, and he was just a nervous wreck. because they were swilling beer in the parking lot, throwing their bottles, and their language was rather coarse. Not rather, their language was coarse. And they were much more disrespectful of the funeral home than the funeral director had hoped them to be. And most of them looked like they could probably individually beat up me and the funeral director at the same time. And I'm just talking about the women. All right? It was a rough situation. I went directly over to talk to the funeral director, and I said, "What's going on here?" And he said, "Well, Jerry, if I'd have told you what was going on, you'd have said no. You wouldn't have done the service." And I said, "Wow, okay, well, we're here. We're going to have to do this." He said, "Be very careful." I said, "Be very careful?" He said, "Yeah, there's 3 gangs here, and they called a truce for this funeral service." I said, "A truce?" He said, "Yeah, they normally, you know, they're into drugs, and there's a lot of violence, and they have turf wars, and they fight each other quite a bit. But we have their promise, there's going to be a truce." I thought, oh, how many more funeral services am I going to get out of this? And that made me, needless to say, a little nervous. And I went off into one of the rooms to sit by myself and do a little praying for my own soul and go over my notes and all of these kinds of things. And then about a half hour before the service began, I went in and spoke with the family briefly, and the deceased wife and parents and those kinds of things. And I went up to the casket, and I noticed what looked like beads of sweat on the deceased. Thought, that's not normal. And asked the funeral director what was going on. Well, they had to delay the service for 3 months, and he had been frozen. And he was thawing out. Now, I know this is not something you normally hear in a service, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of the situation there. This was quite out of the ordinary, folks. Very much so. And I was really worried about all of this and how it was going to go. These were big, nasty-looking people. And I remember thinking to myself, what do they want a Christian minister here for? These are motorcycle gangs. They kill each other. They sell drugs. God only knows what else they do. They war with each other. They had to call a truce just to bury one of their own. And why am I even here? This is a joke. This is ridiculous. This is a waste of my time. I'm going to be standing here saying things they're not going to want to hear, they're not going to accept, they're not going to believe in anyway. Why am I doing this? I was a little bit beside myself and thinking that my words are just going to fall on deaf ears anyway. Well, about 5 minutes before the service started, a couple of people came up to me from one of the groups, one of the gangs, big guys. I'm almost 6 feet tall. I was looking up at these guys. They were the quintessential motorcycle gang members, wearing their colors, the chains, the beard, the hair, all those things that we know Christians don't do. And they said, "We want to talk to you before you start the service." I thought, oh, gee, this is what I need. And they said, we want you to, we don't want you to call the deceased by his real name, because nobody here would know what that is. We want you to refer to him as Bruiser. So, I'd never done a funeral service for a bruiser before. But what are you going to say? Nobody there knew him except for his parents and his wife and kids.